Hi, everybody, and welcome to Trendlines, a podcast on global affairs brought to you by World Politics Review. I'm Judah Grunstein, WPR's editor-in-chief, and I'm joined by WPR managing editor Freddy Deknatel. Hi, Freddy.
Hi, Judah.
We'll be talking again this week about the latest developments in the COVID-19 pandemic, with France and Spain joining Italy in nationwide lockdowns and the rest of the world preparing for the shock. Before we get started, just a quick reminder for everyone listening that the interview episode of the podcast went live Wednesday. Elliot spoke with Heather Conley about how the COVID-19 pandemic is exacerbating the deep divisions plaguing the European Union. Freddie, over the last week or so, and it seems to be moving faster and faster, we saw almost like what seems like a remake of Groundhog Day. Italy went into lockdown about a week or two later. France and Spain, the UK is preparing the ground, it seems like, to move into that territory. And each time we saw this sequence of events where governments took relatively belated action to try to increase public awareness about the pandemic. Then there were voluntary restrictions on social contact and mobility. And once it became clear that people weren't actually taking the risk very seriously, those were followed by mandatory restrictions.
Yeah, it's a sort of unsettling version of dominoes, of one country following another, somewhat reluctantly, it seems, or at least, as you said, belatedly. I think we can finally say, at least with a little more certainty, that most governments around the world, and certainly here in the U.S. and in Europe where you are taking this much more seriously now. The question is whether that is too late, given how much the virus has spread. But there at least is, as Frida Gittes wrote in her column this week, and as many other people have remarked, notably there was a shift in tone from President Trump, although it was, a sort of calculated shift, and he still fell back on many of the usual things he always says from a podium when asked questions by reporters. But I think that it was still significant nonetheless that even someone who had been downplaying this for so many weeks finally seemed to wake up to the reality.
Again, when you look at what's happening in Italy, in France, and Spain, it's a reality that's impossible to ignore at this point. You have these adjustments on a local level and now a national level, where daily life has just been dramatically altered. School closures, so a lot of children at home, people who can work from home, working from home, non-essential businesses closed, restaurants and cafes, bars, and in a sense, what we see happening in a very unsettling way, but at times also in a very collective way and an inspiring way, that people are relearning how to live daily life in real time.
It's true. I think that some of the more uplifting or at least somewhat optimistic things I've read in the last few days have been about that exact thing that you're talking about, in terms of, for all of the government responses or directives from local authorities or national authorities, a lot of things that people are doing are, if not of their own initiative, it's fallen on them personally to sort of take responsibility and to take care of each other in terms of, obviously the socially distancing that people are undertaking. As you mentioned last week, part of that is for people's own health, but in large part it's about the wider health of whatever community you're in, and trying to limit the spread of the virus for that reason. And I think that it is, in its own way, at least somewhat heartening that it is a time where you do see all of a sudden a lot more social responsibility in a way where, states can issue directives, authorities can recommend or even order people to stay home in some cases, but people still have to cooperate, and they have to go along, and they have to take it seriously. And I think that is something that is a shift from what we've seen. And certainly, there's been the wider, it's been remarked in all kinds of different quarters about the kind of the way that people are living distantly anyway already because of, just the, social media and a whole range of ways that sort of modern life had made people more distant. But I do think that this has obviously put that in a very stark and very different light. But I think it's also made it possible that even though we're all, for example, working remotely and keeping apart from one another, that you still can be in contact, obviously given, different ways that people can communicate. And I think that that's something that, as, every day seems to be a whole host of new news and sort of realizations of how much things are changing, that will hopefully be the one thing that sort of keeps everybody positive throughout this, that, there is this sort of community resilience.
It's hard to imagine even 10 years ago, let alone 20 or 30, that modern economies and modern societies could hope to remain functioning and hold together with everyone confined to their quarters, essentially. And so what you said about these new tools that we have for connectivity and interaction in terms of virtual networks, it really is a moment that underscores, even though it's not something that's been ignored, it's definitely a moment that makes you stop and realize the degree to which these things have changed modern life and added elements of resilience to societies. As always with crises, you see newfound heroes spring up. I wasn't in New York in the aftermath of 9/11, but I know from reading about it and from seeing it in subsequent visits that firefighters, for instance, in particular, had a certain status and a certain regard and esteem and admiration among New Yorkers. I saw a similar dynamic at play when I was in Southern California after wildfires there had destroyed a few towns. And any time a fire truck would pass by in the weeks and months after, people would applaud. We see that happening now with healthcare workers. They're the new heroes on the front lines. And at the same time, there's a darker side too, because not everyone can work remotely. And you see that in these countries that have either been on mandatory lockdown or increasingly voluntary shelter on site status, you see that there's a disproportionate impact on the least privileged people, whether they're facing unemployment or because businesses are closing, or whether they're working in what have become really dangerous conditions. When you think of delivery people or shopkeepers and cashiers, these are now essential, critical infrastructure workers that are the glue right now, keeping all of our lives functioning even remotely close to it's not even, it seems hard to even say normal, but that's keeping us alive. And yet their conditions have become increasingly dangerous. And so in some ways also, as is often the case, a crisis like this really highlights and puts a light on the inequalities and the injustices that societies contain and oftentimes don't address until they become as visible as we see right now.
And I think that urgency that you're talking about is a good segue into one of the things we were going to mention, which was already thinking about the kind of response that is going to be required to deal with this crisis, with the, emergency of the pandemic itself in terms of dealing with the health issues, but also then with the wider social or economic crisis that is going to potentially come out of it as well. And that was the subject of the feature article, the in-depth article that we published this week by David Stephen and Alex Evans on planning for the world after the coronavirus pandemic. And this is one of the points they mentioned about how, in terms of looking back at the comparisons and lessons from the 2008 financial crisis, that in looking at big picture and hopefully multilateral responses, that a lot of the people who are left behind, a lot of the people who are in fact in most need of assistance and bailouts, and to use that term, and the kinds of just assistance and aid that are mobilized for other institutions, that's the risk this time. Again, they make a good point of looking at, what the urgency with which governments coordinated global action in the wake of the financial crisis, 10, 12 years ago, and the things that were done effectively, but then the issues that were left aside. And as they put it, the urgent, in that case, crowded out the important. And it's possible that could happen again here, that the very urgent issues obviously need to be addressed, but not at the expense of some of the second order and longer term problems that are sure to come out of this, one of which is going to be inequality, continued inequality, and the fact that sort of people who are hit hardest by this, whether in terms of their own personal well-being or also economic impacts, could fall by the wayside.
And just to unpack all of that, because the article itself and everything you just said is just really dense with a lot of hindsight, a lot of foresight, a lot of analysis, and a lot of prediction. But to begin with, it seems it's still mind-boggling, I think, the degree to which in really the past 10 days probably, how far away that seems. In communicating with David about the article and following up, I said in some ways he's reporting to us from the future, because he's actually in Pisa in Italy, living under lockdown now for more than a week and a half, I believe. And so he's reporting to us from the future, and in a temporal way, it's a very immediate future. But in every other way, it's a very distant future for us still. I've been working remotely and pretty much sheltering in place for about 2 weeks now myself, but it's still not mandatory. You still see people on the streets in ways that I think in Italy and increasingly in France, it's no longer the case. And I think that, again, it's mind-boggling the degree to which in such a short time it seems to be dawning on all of us that we're not going to be able to just, when this is over, return to the past. That to begin with, there will be a lot of structural damage to economies. There will be obviously individual damage to human lives and lives lost. There will be structural divisions within societies. So the idea that that somehow the doors are going to open and everything will go back to normal, I think we're gradually beginning to realize that's not realistic. And especially because it seems increasingly like the consensus seems to be increasingly that we might be dealing with local spikes and recontaminations that will require further social distancing periods, and that even after the initial crisis, after we're past this initial crisis over the next, say, 6 to 8 weeks, that there will still be necessary, it still will be necessary to maybe return to these measures periodically until treatments or a cure or a vaccine are found. I guess the thing that's most glaringly obvious right now, we've seen individual national governments sort of stumble into action, but what's really glaringly lacking, especially compared to 2008, in the aftermath of the global financial crisis, is the lack of any multilateral response. And one of the things that David and Alex point out is that before we get into the second and third order issues that you mentioned. One of the things they point out is that after an initial complacency in 2008, when governments sort of woke up to the danger, there really was what ultimately became a very robust multilateral emergency response. You had the formulation on the fly of the G20. There was a global coordination of financial and response measures, so that countries weren't responding in a way that would create a race to the bottom. And we don't see that at all yet in terms of the initial crisis right now or the second and third order crises that we're likely to see.
No, and if anything, it's been really the opposite so far, of countries closing their borders and essentially trying to seal themselves off from each other. Some of this is, understandable in a sense, to try to limit travel and, transmission across borders, but also the virus is not something that, can be contained. It's the, antithesis of a problem that, whether it's, this sort of resurgent nationalism, populism that you see in different corners of Europe, or obviously Donald Trump's America First agenda here in the U.S., it's really pokes a hole directly in that. One, I think we mentioned this before as well, that, China, if anything, has taken on a role that the U.S. might have in the past, sending teams of doctors and nurses and urgent medical supplies to countries like Italy. The U.S., under the Trump administration, has shown no sign that they're moving in that direction at all. If anything, Trump has fallen back on his, us against the world mentality, this very, this outlook that really scorns multilateralism, which makes you wonder whether any kind of multilateral solution or international cooperation is even possible under Trump, regardless of how bad it might get, just because his own political instincts and really entire presidency is based on scorning that. And I think that we've also seen, that those were dynamics that were also existed before Trump. I mean, as David and Alex pointed out, and as also, we've pointed out before on the podcast, one of the longer term effects of the financial crisis and even the way that it was dealt with was that, there were lingering resentments about, elites, out of touch elites that maybe saved the banking sector and other parts of the economy, but left, large parts of just the general population to sort of pick up the pieces themselves, or at least didn't do a good enough job of explaining to people why certain actions were taken and why others weren't. And that was one of the drivers of this populist resurgence that we've seen. And I think that, that in itself has hurt institutions like the UN and like the World Health Organization and a whole host of other agencies that hopefully could have more of a role to play coming in the weeks and months ahead, but also has just hurt the idea of countries cooperating in general.
They have a line from the article that jumped out at me. The international order's immune system is deeply compromised right now, and the term I would use is atrophied because of these dynamics and phenomena that we've seen over the last 3 years very markedly, or 3 or 4 years. But as you say, where really the roots come in, or the roots trace back to what David and Alex call the second order crisis of the financial crisis, which was the Eurozone crisis and the European debt crisis. And then the third order crisis, as you mentioned, this damage to national politics and multilateral cooperation. One of the ways we always describe WPR is that we're nonpartisan in terms of allegiance to a political party, but we do have a worldview. And our worldview, in terms of the editorial prism that we use, has to do with putting an emphasis on cooperation, multilateralism for global problems as much as is possible. Clearly, there are times and issues for which national sovereignty takes priority, But this pandemic really makes the argument that multilateralism as a default approach to global problems really does really is a strong case. And I think one of the things that I mentioned in my column this week is that in an immediate crisis response right now, hopefully we'll see, and I don't know why we're not seeing some sort of convening of almost like a global Marshall Plan for the emergency production of needed medical equipment, of treatments and vaccine research on a global level, so that this doesn't become a zero-sum competition for who hoards the most ventilators. Again, this isn't likely to stave off this immediate spike and this immediate crisis now in the 4 to 6 week period ahead. But it could help for countries that are a little behind in terms of the curve of the spread of the pandemic, and it could also really prove to be valuable if indeed it becomes, instead of a flattening of the curve, a repeated flattening of the curve lower and lower. And flattening the curve, again, just a reminder to everyone listening, is really just a way to get the amount of infections at the peak below the level where healthcare systems are saturated. And another element or variable in that is to raise the level of healthcare systems so that they have more capacity and aren't saturated so quickly. So I think that really does need to be in the equation. And then thinking about those second order and third order crises, as you mentioned, I really do believe that if the social contract and social safety nets aren't reimagined in ways and terms that have been part of the dialogue and the political discussion in the U.S., for instance, during the Democratic primaries and elsewhere, that will really be necessary to stave off further moves toward the political extremes in Western democracies.
Right, and especially for younger people, this will be the second economic crisis likely that they will have seen already. I mean, speaking for myself, I was graduating from college just amid the global financial crisis, and if a recession is likely, or if it's worse than a recession, that is certainly the worry that much economic destabilization, and certainly the feeling that younger people bore the brunt in a lot of ways of the financial crisis a decade or more ago and have never really fully recovered from it.
And now they're being asked to make enormous sacrifices to protect the more vulnerable older generation. And, I think I actually had a paragraph on this in my column for Wednesday, and I had to cut it for space reasons. So I was glad to see that David and Alex actually mentioned it in their article, because I think there's a tendency and again, it's every generation always says, every older generation always says, oh, the kids don't get it, or the kids aren't up to the challenge. The younger generation is no good. I think that there has been this sort of recurrent theme of maligning the younger generation, millennial generation, the generation after millennials, et cetera. And yet when you look at the kind of sacrifices that you made after the financial crisis and what's being asked now, it's, this idea of the greatest generation. Every generation, I think, has a claim to the greatest generation, but the younger people right now are really being asked to step up to the plate, and they are. And I think that after when we're out of the immediate crisis, there's going to have to be some accommodation to make sure that the financial burden is shared afterward, and that there is some way to try to make up for the ground that's been lost and the stability that was lost in this period. And I guess I just want to end on a positive note, something that I saw this week that really kind of helped me frame things. It was a letter by the president or the chancellor of the University of Chicago to the student body and the faculty and the parents. And he's a historian, and he just sort of talked about the way in which, as a historian, you read texts and documents through history of people who were living through extremely challenging times and dark times and scary times. And the point was essentially, this is also part of what makes us human. This is the one that we got dealt. Everyone who's living through it right now, and the history of humankind is that we rise to the occasion and we do what we have to do. And so that really gave me a little reassurance and a framing of it that sort of bolstered my morale. So I pass it along. All right. Time for us to mention a couple WPR articles, and I think we both selected ones that don't necessarily have to do with the COVID-19 pandemic. Freddy, which one did you want to mention?
Andrew McDowell's latest briefing. It was an interview with Kosovo's new Prime Minister, Albin Kurti, who was elected a few months ago in a very close election, but took a long time to form a government. It's a very interesting interview. Kurti is known in Kosovo. He was given a nickname by reporters years ago as Kosovo's Che Guevara that he picked up in the late 1990s when he led student protests against Serbia's treatment of ethnic Albanians there before Kosovo's independence. And then more recently, Kurti led a fairly notorious scene in Parliament a few years ago where lawmakers set off tear gas to protest actions that Parliament was taking. So he's a bit of a unusual choice for prime minister, but he's also fairly optimistic about Kosovo's prospects going forward, most of all trying to fight a push from Serbia to limit countries that are recognizing Kosovo internationally. So I'd urge everyone to read it.
There was a great line from someone Andrew interviewed for the article. I forget who called him a political Greta Thunberg. That one jumped out at me. And I'll mention a briefing co-authored by Madeline Velturo and Shannon Dick on how the proliferation of arms in Africa's Sahel region is escalating violence between and among herders and farmers. We've covered this issue of violence between nomadic herders and sedentary farmers in the region numerous times in the past, but it often gets obscured by coverage of regional governments' fight against Islamist militants. Even though, as Madeline and Shannon point out, herder-farmer conflict in Nigeria actually killed 6 times as many people as Boko Haram did in 2018. They both explain why increasing military aid to regional governments isn't the solution. Instead, with the U.S. currently considering plans to draw down its military presence there, Washington should focus on boosting non-military approaches to help address the issue, and they go on to detail some of those. All right, 2 things I want to mention before we get to the Who Said That segment. First, if you'd like to stay up to date on everything we cover at WPR, go ahead and sign up for our free daily newsletter at wpr.pub/trendlines. In addition to free access to selected WPR articles all week long, you'll also get a promotional code for a 25% discount on a WPR subscription. Again, the URL is wpr.pub/trendlines. And second, if you'd like to drop us a line with questions or comments, you can email us at podcast@worldpoliticsreview.com. All right, time for Who Said That? And before we get into it, Freddie, I thought I'd preface this by saying we discussed before recording whether we might not skip Who Said That this week, given the gravity of the situation. And we decided that a little bit of humor is always good for picking up people's spirits, especially in difficult circumstances. So we're going to go ahead with it in that spirit. So what do you got for me?
All right. This is not perhaps the funniest Who Said That quote that I found recently, but timely nonetheless. Here's the quote. "Since he has no majority in the parliament, he has closed the parliament. Since he should have stood trial, he has closed the court."
That's Benjamin Netanyahu.
Yeah, it's about Benjamin Netanyahu. This was a post written on Facebook by Yair Lapid, the number 2 in the blue and white coalition, Netanyahu's rival, talking about the move that Netanyahu has made in Israel recently that he has framed as an aggressive move to fight the spread of coronavirus, but that his critics see as a political ploy that could threaten Israel's democracy.
We'll actually have a piece coming up by Prachi Vidwans, our new associate editor, on the impact and interplay of the pandemic on democracy and democracies. So obviously we're seeing a lot of maneuvers out there. Here goes mine. I think that what we'll say is a correct answer if you can identify the product that's being spoken about. If you can get the person saying it, that's extra points. But here it goes. Yes, I have enough. They have it on shelves again. But there's enough in the whole country for the coming 10 years. We can all poop for 10 years.
This is about toilet paper, which there's been a run on everywhere, it seems.
It is, in fact. And it's the Dutch Prime Minister Mark Rutte in an exchange with a shopper while he was visiting a supermarket to show support for the workers there who are still showing up every day. And yes, the global panic buying of toilet paper, which is relatively unexplainable. And I should mention there's a British publication called Private Eye. It's a sort of comedic publication and a muckraking publication. And the cover of their issue this week is 48 sheets of toilet paper free with this issue. It's printed on rag paper.
That's good.
All right. Great stuff, Freddy. Thanks.
Thanks, Judah.
If you'd like to stay up to date on everything we cover at WPR, go ahead and sign up for our daily newsletter at wpr.pub/trendlines. In addition to free access to selected WPR articles all week long, you'll also get a promotional code for a 25% discount on a WPR subscription. And if you'd like to send comments or questions, email us at podcast@worldpoliticsreview.com. Trendlines is produced and edited by Peter Dury. You can follow him and World Politics Review on Twitter, and you can find links to pieces covering the issues we talked about in the show notes on worldpoliticsreview.com. Have a great weekend, and see you next week for 2 new episodes of Trendlines.